So those of you that have been watching me for at least a little while know that, to me, obscurity does not in any way mean any less important. Just under various set of circumstances, depending on the time, place, who a person may be, there's endless factors. Certain people who have endured unfortunate tragedies, in this particular case, tragedies that have gone completely unsolved, some people just are remembered more than others. The Black Dahlia case will never be forgotten. The JFK assassination will never be forgotten. These great mysteries that drive us crazy. It can literally, lead people to violent arguments, push the limit of friendships, just because people want to argue about something that none of us have a definitive answer on. You know me, just because it's someone that I can guarantee, at least in this case, I guarantee the case I'm going to talk about tonight has never been discussed on anybody else's YouTube. I will give away all the money in my bank account if it has. Metaphorically speaking, because the thought of being flat broke makes me suddenly question everything I'm saying. But I'm trying to make a point. Tonight, or today, I guess depending on the time of day it is for you that you're watching this, this is, I think, potentially, maybe not the number one, but this is probably the most obscure case I've ever covered in terms of the amount of information that was available via old newspaper articles, because some of these cases I covered, that's all there is for me to find. Other than a few newspaper articles spanning a period of about roughly 11 months, I found nothing else about this person, about this case. I can't even find this person on findagrave.com, which is extremely rare. So, this one deserves attention, just like everyone else. Vast obscurity does not mean you deserve to be forgotten. All that said, we're going to go back to 1970 and the baffling, bewildering, almost impossible, I would think, to solve murder of a woman named Clara Mickelson. Clara Mickelson was 65 years old in the spring of 1970, and she owned and operated the El Dorado Motel, which was located in the northwestern portion of Eugene, Oregon. Fortunately, doing a little searching around, I was able to find the address to that site and see that there is still a motel there to this day, so I can only assume it's the same place. It seems unlikely that one motel would be torn down and replaced with another motel while that happens, but it looks like there's a budget lodge there today. At least there was as of a few months ago. That was the site of the El Dorado Motel, which Clara ran. On March 5th, 1970, Clara left the motel, perhaps for the day. I mean, obviously when you run a motel, there needs to, pretty much always needs to be somebody there, in case there's any issues, any emergencies, anybody's needed at the front desk. So I'm assuming I don't know the details of this, but I'm wondering if maybe she operated it with her daughter and or other family members. My reasoning for that I will be discussing in just a few moments. But whatever the case, on the evening of March 5th, 1970, Clara left the motel. And a little bit of time passed, and her daughter either was already at the motel and noticed that she'd been gone for a while, or she just noticed in general that her mom had been gone for a while, and she found a note that had been left at the hotel, presumably for her or whoever worked there, that simply stated that she was going to be out of town for 3 days. This was the note that Clara left behind, presumably in that moment explaining why she was gone all of a sudden and had been gone for a while. And I mean, right away, that should probably instill someone with a few red flags, because, you know, if you have a business to run, you know, you're the owner and operator of a whole motel, you have employees, you have family, you probably should be giving someone a definitive heads up, calling someone, hey, something came up, I need to go out of town for a few days, so that people know that you're not going to be there, so someone else can, I mean, at the very least, someone else has to be working the desk or on the premises of the motel. What if, God forbid, 3 a.m., one of the rooms catches on fire? And there's you know, certainly people at the motel can call the police or call the fire department, but it's going to look pretty bad when nobody's there on the premises who's actually, like, running the place. Anyway, what I'm getting at is it seems a little strange when you run your business to leave a note that you're just assuming someone's going to see and then just leaving and not actually letting someone know ahead of time that you're going to, not just that you're not going to be there the rest of the night, but that you're going to be gone for a few days. So this was already kind of strange, and Clara's daughter caught on to that pretty quick. Clara's daughter thought, this is a little odd. I kind of get the feeling she may have been forced to write this note, and that possibly she had been taken from the motel as opposed to leaving on her own. Because, I mean, really, there's only one of two things that could have happened. One is she just suddenly left this note and then kind of left, again, seemingly kind of out of nowhere, and didn't really give anybody, you know, any real advanced warning that she was going to be leaving, which is a little strange, but I mean, I guess it's happened before. The other, and seemingly much more likely, situation is that someone, whoever it was, showed up on the premises, maybe went into the office while she was there. Another possibility is Clara was really planning on leaving for the night, and as she was leaving the hotel and going to her car, she had an encounter with someone, and that individual forced her to leave with them. They abducted her. And a pretty simple way to at least get a jump on authorities or anybody that might notice something doesn't seem quite right about all this is, hey, leave a note that says, hey, I'm going to be gone for a couple of days, so that hopefully, if all turns out right for you, no one's going to question anything till a few days go by. And then maybe, you know, 2 or 3 days becomes 4 or 5 days and people start getting concerned. And I apologize, the light I'm using is flickering just a bit. I'm sure you're noticing that. So not to jump to any rash conclusions, just based on the strangeness of the rapidness with which Clara Mickelson left her place of business. But the abruptness with which she left was not the only thing that rang as strange, as authorities were let know that maybe something is awry when Clara's daughter contacted them. As the situation was examined, there were 3 pretty significant things that also suggested something isn't right here. Possibly the most important in terms of thinking someone forcibly abducted Clara is that all of the money from the register in the office at the motel had been removed, which suggests probably a robbery of some kind, and a robbery situation where the individual involved decided to take the one witness in question, which was Clara, with them for whatever reason. So that's pretty... When that happens, someone suddenly disappears and the money disappears as well, if it weren't for the events that were going to unfold over the next several months, one might think, well, what if, Clara's 65, what if she just snatched up the money herself and took off for a few days and decided to have fun, despite, that being kind of risky in terms of her business. But, initially I could see people wondering, well, maybe she just took the money. And maybe at the time they can make that argument. But the two other issues with this situation is, one, Clara, who's going to leave for a few days, took no luggage with her. No toiletries, no clothes, no food, nothing. And beyond that, and more disconcerting than not taking any luggage, Clara, who again is, getting into her later years, she's in her mid-60s, she had a heart medication that she needed to take regularly. She also left that behind when she presumably left on her own for a few days. So all of these factors point to somebody who left in a hurry, whether it was by their own decision or somebody else forcing them along. The last minute note, the forgetting things like luggage and medication that's critical to your health, and then the sudden, vanishing of all the money that was at the motel. This was looking very fishy, and now we have somebody who's missing. They are gone. And what's interesting is, if Clara Mickelson was abducted from the motel, you would think whoever abducted her, grabbed her, grabbed the cash, and quickly rushed to a vehicle they had. Obviously, if they're going to take the person with them that's witnessing them stealing the money, they would probably have a getaway vehicle, or at least somebody with them with a getaway vehicle. But it appears that Clara and her abductor, whatever the circumstances were, they left in her car because her car was gone. And initially, one might see that as possibly another ruse to try to throw authorities off. You move her car, you ditch it somewhere out of town. It takes them a couple of weeks to a month to who knows how much longer before they find it. And it's just another thing for the authorities to be confused by. However, on March 8th, Clara hasn't even been missing a full 3 days yet. Her car is found, and it appeared, as it was described, it appeared her car had been hidden to a degree. They said it was hidden among big lava rocks, which I would assume nobody would be able to move. And if you could pick up little rocks and move them, that would take forever to obstruct a whole car. So I'm guessing the car was specifically parked in an area that kept it most out of view from outsiders. And I looked at the general area where her car was found, because it was stated that her vehicle was found approximately 8 miles north of the really small town, not super small, but small town of Blackfoot, Idaho, which is off to the eastern portion of Idaho. It's some 700 miles away from Eugene, so this is really, really far away from where Clara was last seen. And if you even look at a Google Maps satellite view of the area, you can see it's just this big reddish, charcoalish colored area. It's probably all volcanic rock through there, and kind of right in the middle of that is where Clara's car is found. So this is a lead for authorities, but it's also kind of disconcerting. What's her car doing so far away from home in this very rural area, and why was it just ditched here randomly? And Clara's not there with the car, so she is still missing. Fast forward just a few days later, a farmer on his land, roughly 2 miles north of the small Idaho town of Hagerman, roughly 160 miles west of Blackfoot. So it's actually in between Blackfoot and Eugene. this farmer randomly stumbles onto a purse that, upon examining the contents, it was discovered to be Clara Mickelson's purse. So it's an interesting set of circumstances. Whatever happens, she leaves in this car, this long cross the whole state of Oregon into Idaho, and for whatever reason, her purse ends up a little bit north of this town. And then it's another 150 or so miles before her car gets ditched. So there's kind of this confusion about what does that all mean? I mean, at the time, nobody could say, because despite these discoveries, they didn't bring authorities any closer to figuring out who was responsible. Nobody saw anything, is how it seems. I mean, if somebody had seen her being rushed away from the hotel, if someone saw her being led away by a guy with a gun or something like that, people would have been calling the police right away. There would have been witnesses. There would have been descriptions about who took Clara from her motel. Something would have happened much more quickly, but that didn't happen because no one saw her leave, after she left the hotel, and nobody saw her afterward. And these things like her purse and her car are being found several days later. So it's feeling pretty bleak in terms of, like, is Clara still alive at this point? And as the case starts going pretty cold, there was actually a few articles posted. Most of them were posted on October 1st, 1970, so a few months down the road. And they were focusing on recent unsolved homicides that had been going on in Oregon, and they reference the Clara Mickelson one. Oh, she disappeared from her hotel, or her motel that she ran a few months ago. That hasn't been solved. So it was nice that those pieces were posted, because it did kind of briefly shine light on that case again. And what's interesting is that very same day, October 1st, 1970, a body was found in Utah. And it was the body of a woman that seemed to generally match Clara Mickelson's overall body structure. And authorities that looked it over said the body looked like whoever it was, they'd been dead for a few months. So on that very same day, this new lead comes along. However, upon a more detailed examination at the autopsy, getting full measurements of the woman and checking dental records, it was determined that this individual was not Clara Mickelson. And so, for a brief fleeting moment, it looked like at least the location of the victim and whether she's still dead or alive would have been resolved, or felt like it was going to be resolved, and then it was back to the drawing board again. And so almost another 5 months go by, and there's nothing. There's not really a new lead, no new clues, no updates, nothing. The story just kind of disappears from newspapers and media and the public attention, and I mean, there's nothing to report on. Then we come to February 21st, 1971. There's 4 kids playing down by a creek, less than a mile east of Hagerman, Idaho, the close vicinity of where Clara's purse was found. And as these kids were playing down by the creek, they discovered the body of a woman that had been left there in the creek. So that whole process that happened back in October in Utah starts again. The body is taken to a hospital for an autopsy to be performed, and people are wondering, I mean, this body was less than 3 miles from where Clara's purse was found. So there's immediate interest, is this Clara Mickelson this time around? And through use of dental records during her, during and or after the autopsy, these remains were identified as the body of Clara Mickelson. She had been murdered pretty brutally and left in this creek. And it's very interesting because it means more than likely, at least, she was at least alive probably. Well, I mean, now that I think about it, I don't know. It's impossible to say exactly when she was killed. If she's taken captive from Eugene, she could have been killed right outside of town. She could have been kept hostage for a while, either because the person that took her wanted it that way, or maybe whoever took her kind of was trying to figure out what to do. And like, do I kill her? Do I let her go? Which is better? And then eventually decided on murder, and so she could have stayed alive for many, many hours as they traveled across Oregon and into Idaho. Whenever she was killed, it is interesting that, if you look, you have like small town of Hagerman right here. And I know the directions I'm doing are going to be the reversal of you because I'm looking at the camera and you're looking at me. But if they're traveling towards Hagerman, the purse ends up here and the body ends up like here. So that's certainly interesting and worth reflecting on. And, a small part of me, a lot of these little details, if it wasn't for the fact that Clara's body was found and someone killed her, which doesn't necessarily disprove this as a possibility, because one direction I was thinking of, and I very rarely go in this direction, and I feel like, investigators go this way too often when they have a case that they can't really crack and they don't really have any suspects. They fall back on the classic, well, they probably left on their own. And usually there's not really any evidence to defend that. But I look at Clara Mickelson, who personality-wise, how she was, who she was, I don't know anything about her. But she's in her mid-60s. She knows that she's kind of going into her, the final years of life. Could you see someone at that age, maybe they just decide, I'm done with this crap? I think she'd been running that hotel. I keep saying hotel. She'd been running that motel for a really long time. And like, you could think maybe she got sick of it and she just wanted to just disappear. So she, leaves this misleading note, and then takes off, and, she throws her purse somewhere, and then she ditches her car somewhere and makes people think she's dead. And that all might line up perfectly and make sense if, one, she didn't forget something as important as her heart medication. If you don't have medication that you desperately need, it's not really going to be a great, final few years of your life disappearing if you don't have that. And of course, she's found dead, and not by, anything other than it being a homicide. She could have grabbed all of that dough up and took off on her own, and then maybe picked up a hitchhiker and, ended up being the wrong person. She could have maybe had a secret association with somebody that she was leaving with, and that person turned out to not be, say, the trustworthy individual that she thought that person was going to be, and they double-crossed her and killed her off. These are these are like the most far-fetched theories in my opinion, but you can't fully 100% dismiss the idea that maybe she was just leaving town altogether and that she encountered the wrong person. It still doesn't explain a lot, though. Like leaving without your heart medication. So I'm mostly just mentioning that to throw that stuff out there for reflection, because I wholeheartedly, based, on what little we know, I think that she was likely, I almost feel it's more likely that she was probably grabbed from inside probably the office of the motel. It's where the cash would have been. And, it seems less likely that somebody would have ambushed her in the parking lot, because then they would have to go back into the building to get the money to come back out. And that's a pretty risky proposition for someone who's trying to, rob a place fairly quickly and get out of there before anyone sees them. So, it's one of those circumstances. I mean, it's kind of a brazen abduction. It wasn't that late in the day. And it's one of those things where all it would have taken is one person walking into that office, and you would have had a witness, and this whole thing could have unfolded in a completely different way. But that's the case for a lot of these frustrating unsolved murder cases. Is sometimes, people will plan crimes out, to the letter, and then they screw up and get busted, like, right away. And then there's these other people that almost look like they just didn't plan things out very well, and they commit these crimes that, it's almost bizarre that nobody saw anything, and yet somehow they get away with it, and they go unknown for their crime, possibly forever. I don't think this case is ever going to get solved because nobody even talks about it anymore. I feel like and I don't know, maybe there's some cold case unit that has this on their books and is going to look into it, but somehow I doubt that. I couldn't even find one article of anything about this. No, nothing on Google about Clara Mickelson at all. The only stuff I found was old newspaper articles. That was it. So something tells me this case hasn't really gotten a lot of attention since the early 70s, and is probably not going to get a lot of attention in the future, even though I hope it does. Especially considering the fact, it's not just that you have a murder case, someone who was likely abducted, but this was, the FBI got involved in this case because here's a woman that seemingly disappears from Oregon and turns up dead in Idaho. So you have someone who likely abducted someone and then took them across state lines. And, kidnapping is already a federal crime, but you interject crossing state lines into it, and there's another element, another wrinkle to it. But of course, unfortunately, the FBI got involved in that. Nothing really changed, despite them getting involved. But, once Clara's body was uncovered and examined, they said that she still had a gag in her mouth. So obviously she had probably been asphyxiated to some degree, or at least she had that stuck in her mouth to keep her from screaming or something like that. In addition to having a gag still in her mouth, almost a year later when she's found, it was noted more than anything else that she had suffered severe blunt force trauma to her abdominal area. There was extensive blows that had been done. Several of her ribs had been broken. And granted, by the time you're in your mid-60s, these are more brutal, but it showed that there was like brutal violence. Whoever killed her likely, maybe they were strong enough to just use their fists, but they either did that or they had some blunt object that they just beat her chest in with. And that blunt force trauma may have been responsible for killing her. She may have been asphyxiated. And it may have been something else that they just couldn't decipher through the process of doing that autopsy. But it was obvious that she had been brutalized to some degree, that she had been murdered. She didn't just, drive her car 150 miles past where she's going to die, leave the car there, backtrack on foot or hitchhiking or whatever, and then kill herself. That was not remotely a part of this situation. So, whatever the circumstances are, I almost wonder if the person responsible was maybe just another effort to throw the authorities' attention off. Maybe it was just there was some confusion. What do I do? I gotta get rid of the body. I gotta get rid of her purse. I gotta get rid of this car eventually. Because I just find it interesting that, and it could be that they came more from the north. So they came down into Hagerman like this and then turned. And that would explain, they're coming down. ditches the purse here, gets through Hagerman, starts going east, and that's when her body is ditched. And what's interesting is when I looked on Google Maps, even to this day, there's not really any roads that go near. There's like one creek that I noticed that runs just a little bit east of Hagerman. And, things like creeks and rivers, those usually don't just, pop up out of nowhere. So I'm assuming this creek was still there in 1970. And it's just about the right distance outside of Hagerman, less than a mile. And there's not really any roads anywhere near that particular creek, which I would think had to be the location where her body was found. So did the person responsible, did they just drive off road till they found this spot that seemed logical to ditch her body? Did this individual drag her a really long distance from the vehicle? Who's to say? And I mean, at the end of the day, these details don't matter that much, but they help you try to understand exactly what happened in a situation where there's so little that we know about. And it's interesting. I mean, it almost seems like the purse was, even though it was discovered earlier, it almost seems like the purse was there was almost more effort put into hiding the purse than hiding the body, because the body was closer to town and closer to people than the purse was. It was just convenient that a farmer there stumbled onto it. But whatever the circumstances, it seems the killer assaulted Clara to the point of killing her somewhere between Eugene and Hagerman, left the body there, and then continued on. Now, the location where the car was found, while it was mostly referenced in terms of its distance from Blackfoot, the location that they give, being about 8 miles north of that town, would put the car like barely 5 miles from Idaho Falls, which is a slightly larger town. So I could almost see the individual responsible, like, knowing that town is fairly close by, ditching the car just far enough away that it's not too hard to get into Idaho Falls, and they either steal a car there or rent a car, do whatever they can to continue being on the move and get the hell out of there. It seems unlikely and or stupid that the person responsible would just linger, within a couple of miles of where the car that belonged to the woman that they just murdered, that they would do that they would stay close to that area. And then again, this person may have lived in, what were the reasons that when Clara Mickelson was abducted, that she was taken from Eugene in Oregon into Idaho? Is that because the person who did this lived in Idaho, or, lived beyond Idaho? We don't know. So there's so many questions. And it's just so interesting that we have, an older woman who's just running this kind of modest motel. This wasn't like a grand place. This wasn't a, $200 a room a night joint. This is just a run-of-the-mill motel. I mean, there probably wasn't even a massive amount of money in the register. So why someone would go to these lengths to rob her, abduct her, drive her hundreds and hundreds of miles before ditching her body, and then obviously driving on even further east before ditching the car. It just seems like so much to do. Again, we don't know what the killer was thinking. Maybe they were dabbling with, should I kill her? Should I not? Should I kill her? Should I not? And that's why he kept her alive for so long. Because you'd think if you're going to kill someone after something like this, you drive her, you don't have to go too far outside of Eugene. Eugene is surrounded by a lot of rural landscape. You wouldn't have had to drive that far outside of Eugene before you'd probably be able to get rid of her body. And it would be much longer before it was found than it actually ended up being in this case. So why this person kept her alive so long before killing her, why they chose a creek near this town of Hagerman, it boggles my mind. Why the individual kept the car till that specific moment, why they decided kind of around Blackfoot and Idaho Falls to finally ditch the car, who knows? I honestly, like, when I think about it and reflect and talk about it, it almost makes me feel like this was probably not a super skilled criminal and someone who was kind of, once he had this hostage and had her money, a lot of what was happening in the aftermath was a lot of like kind of just making decisions on the fly, like knowing maybe I'm gonna have to kill this person, but then when you kill them, like, okay, what am I gonna do with the body? Figure out what to do with that. I have her purse. Okay, I gotta throw that out somewhere. Holy shit, I'm driving a dead woman's car. I have to get rid of this car now. How am I? That's kind of how this all feels to me, and I could totally be wrong. That's just the vibes that I get from what we know in this case. And unfortunately, the discovery of Clara's body, which was, probably the most significant thing to happen when you're worried, is somebody missing? Are they dead? What is it? And they actually find the body, so they have a resolution in terms of whether this person's dead or not, whether the authorities have a homicide on their hands. That was really where everything kind of dried up, because they didn't have a suspect. Nobody really knows for certain why this particular individual was targeted, why they were targeted at their place of business. We don't know exactly what kind of weapon was used. We don't have a murder weapon. The authorities didn't seem to really have anything resembling a suspect on this. There's nothing. You don't even have a crime scene in terms of where was she the moment she was killed. All we know is where her body was found. And somehow I doubt she wasn't killed till she was right next to that creek. She was killed before she was ditched there. So, I mean, really, even if you want to put the pressure on and say, solve this, what do you have to go on? There's nothing. I wouldn't know where to go in this case. Unless there's a written confession sitting somewhere waiting to be discovered, where do you go? So it makes sense to me that, late February 1971, Clara Mickelson's body is found and she's identified, and it's, made abundantly clear that she was murdered. The last article I found, the last anything I found referencing this case was a newspaper article from April 1st, 1971, just a little over a month after her body was found. And all that article stated was the FBI is getting involved now, which I discussed a little earlier why the FBI got involved. And that was it. There was no new updates. And I continued searching up Clara Mickelson's name in my newspaper database. I even changed how I spelled her last name to see if there was just anything out there. And there was nothing. By the start of April 1971, there's nothing out there. I'm sure, Eugene and whatnot, I'm sure they have evidence and case files on this, and hopefully they have some DNA from her. I don't know how decomposed her body was when they found her. If you have some DNA, hey, maybe there's some hope. You need DNA in this case because you don't really have anything else, and just hope that might bring someone out. But other than that, just nothing. I found nothing from the last 50 plus years referencing this case. It is, as far as society is concerned, absolutely, totally forgotten, faded off into obscurity. Which is one of the primary reasons why I chose to cover it. Because even the obscure and forgotten cases are people who had lives, they had families, and their lives ended in ways that people's lives never should. So the moment I saw that this case was pretty much forgotten within pretty much a year of it happening, and it happened so many years ago, I knew I had to cover this. If nothing, just to make it just a little blip, this little fading dot on the internet of all the crap that's out there. I had to do at least a little something to try to keep this case alive. the minimal benefits that provides. So it's the same old thing. I hope someday justice is served and we find out who was responsible for Clara Mickelson's murder. Obviously, I'd like to know more details about it. I'd like to know who did it and why. But the who is probably the most important when we're talking about justice. And that is the tragic and mostly forgotten and unlikely to ever be solved abduction and murder of Clara Mickelson back in 1970. That story told, as always, I'd like to thank you that are watching so much for watching, for supporting me, supporting my channel. I hope you understand why I cover a lot of the cases I do in this series and why I don't necessarily cover more current ones that a lot more people are covering. I like looking back at these old cases, and I feel like old cases, especially the super obscure ones, deserve a place to be remembered and brought back about. And that's one of my primary motivating factors in all that. And I appreciate you stopping by, and as always, if you're new or you haven't gotten around to it yet, give the video a like. It helps it out. If you like what I'm doing and want to see more of what I've got, I have too many videos on my channel, so there's a lot more there for you to see, and if you subscribe, you'll always know when the next one's coming along. And I also have a Patreon page if you want to help me out that way. That's huge. The more help I get on Patreon, the more time I could spend producing stuff like this. The link to that is in the description with this video, as well as links to my Facebook page, my Instagram, and I even have a Reddit subreddit page that admittedly I've barely used yet, but I'm kind of starting to spend more time on Reddit, so hopefully I'll start making that a little bit more lively to some degree or another. And all that said, till next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.